This week's focus on motivation and adjustment addresses how your hidden depths affect your cross-cultural adjustment in ways you might not expect. This e-lesson will extend our thinking about motivation or CQ drive. It also previews CQ strategy by looking long-term at sustainability. It will invite you to consider the anchors in your life that are deeper than motivation, deep enough to safeguard your development of CQ and engagement in your chosen culture. The lecture will address 4 big ideas. Listen for them: concern, border crossing, sustainability, and a synthesis of all 3 that I call sustainable cultural concern. We'll begin with concern. We'll have to get to a definition of it in a roundabout way, starting with a necessary dose of reality. With any planning for success, there's a flip side, a related but admittedly less pleasant scenario: failure. Have you ever thought about who fails cross-culturally and why? If we were meeting face-to-face, I would be scribbling your answers onto a whiteboard. You'd easily be able to come up with some answers. People who are socially insensitive, who aren't very smart, or who come across as arrogant or lazy. People whose hearts really aren't in it to begin with, you might say. And it would be reassuring to think that only these kinds of people fail in crossing cultures. But is that idea true? I think that if you believed it, you wouldn't be taking this course. I think you already know that talented people can fail. We'd have to add them to the list. I've never met a thinking, well-intentioned professional who's gone into a cross-cultural endeavor with plans to fail or to be mediocre. Not one, but it happens, unfortunately. You have to face it up front. People like you can fail. You can fail. But I'm motivated, you object. I won't fail. Well, I hope you won't. But here's the catch. Just as good people can fail, motivation can too. Motivation can fail. That's not a happy thought, but we know it's true because we have said or heard people say things like, "I've lost my motivation." Sometimes even the most motivated people end up settling for less. They settle for half-hearted cultural involvement, go home early, or walk away from a hard-earned partnership. If you don't want to join them, and I know you don't, you have to have a reality check up front. You have to think through the threats to your motivation, and you have to dig down to something deeper than motivation. I certainly agree with this week's authors about the importance of motivation, but I would take it a step further than they do. I believe there's something more fundamental than motivation that determines sustainable intercultural success over the long term. When difficulties arise, and they always do, and they will for you too, people find themselves asking a very raw and troubling question, and here it is. Why bother? I'm sorry it's an irreverent question, but it's the one we ask. Why bother being motivated? Why bother building my CQ skill? Consider these sentiments of discouraged cross-cultural workers.
Why bother continuing in a relationship with these people? They are so hard to work with. I was motivated by the money, but it's not worth the hassle anymore. I could make the same money in a different job at home, or I could transfer to a different country.
Why bother partnering on this project? I was motivated by a real desire to build a strong international team, but it's so much easier to do things separately.
Why bother helping these foreign children? I was motivated by a sincere humanitarian commitment, but now I see that I can help plenty of children and do a better job of it right here on my own turf in my home country where I know the rules.
Livermore would consider all of these descriptions of discouragement to be related to extrinsic or intrinsic motivation. I agree with him to the extent that these people have lost much of their initial motivation. But when people at such low points of frustration ask themselves, why bother? Why am I going to all this effort? Why am I complicating things by tossing culture into the mix? Do they have a good answer? Do they have a really compelling reason to get motivated again when they could much more easily stick with people and systems they understand? Certainly, discouraged people can work to renew their motivation. They can pick themselves up and gather their energy for another try. They can rekindle the dying embers, but will they? You can probably guess from your own experience that some people will and others won't. We've all done it ourselves in many areas of life. Sometimes we've attended to our waning motivation and worked to rekindle it. Other times, we've just walked away. Why? What makes the difference? Pause the e-lesson and think about it for a moment. I believe that people who hang in there when their motivation wanes are those with a very good answer to the why bother question. Why bother picking yourself up and trying again when you have plenty of compelling reasons to give up? The why bother answer is what I call concern. Concern is the bedrock upon which motivation and the other domains of CQ are founded. Now put a mental bookmark on that word concern, and we'll circle back to it in a minute. But first, to supply a better background for this week's concepts, let me tell you the beginning and the end of a research story. From 2012 to 2014, I conducted a study to understand how students at a Christian university navigate unfamiliar people, ideas, and situations. That's the beginning of the story. The middle, how I conducted the study, is interesting, and if you'd like to know more, I've included it as a separate optional e-lesson. But let's jump to the end. Throughout the course of the study, I noticed something that came up over and over again, something I heard in the stories and reflections of every participant. It was an underlying sense of I should or I ought to that either propelled them to venture outside their zones of comfort and familiarity or that kept them close to home base. It wasn't motivation exactly. It wasn't strategy exactly either. It was something different. And can you guess what I called it? Concern. Remember the answer to the why bother questions? Why bother stepping out of my comfort zone? Every participant in my research had concern of some type, expressed as a sort of life calling or orientation. Their governing systems were rooted in three types of reasons. Some were metaphysical or cosmic, like, what does God want me to do or be? Others were existential, like, what makes life real or meaningful? And others were ethical, like, what is just or reflects integrity in my relationships with others? Some had what I called an in-group orientation, or a commitment to identify with and protect their spheres of familiarity. Interaction with cultural or other outsiders was negotiable at best and threatening at worst. They seemed to live by a basic assumption that this is who we are, this is how we do things, and this is the right and reasonable sphere in which I'm going to live my life. Participants with this orientation evidenced tendencies toward assimilation. According to developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, the cognitive process of assimilation prevents new information from changing the way a person already thinks or views the world. Assimilators tend to interpret new experiences, like a cross-cultural encounter, in accordance with what they already believe or perceive, rather than allowing the new experience to change their internal world. If Liberians shake hands in an unfamiliar way, for example, then an assimilator assumes that the handshake must be wrong or strange or something to overlook. An assimilator does not expand his or her internal repertoire of ways to shake hands. In contrast, participants with what I call a border crossing concern expressed a rule of life that placed great value on venturing outside of their zones of familiarity and comfort. They crossed borders of all kinds: cultural, ethnic, generational, ideological, economic, educational, ability and disability, with a conviction that it was right. These participants tended toward accommodation rather than assimilation. Piaget posited accommodation as a process through which people change internal structures, like perceptions, beliefs, etc., in response to new information. With an unfamiliar Liberian handshake, accommodators recognize the newness of the gesture, consider how Liberians perform it, and incorporate it into their internal repertoire of possible ways to shake hands. Which type of concern do you think contributes to sustainability and intercultural competency? It's obvious, right? Border crossing concern. My research suggested that sustainability was related to an interplay of CQ, or skill, and border crossing concern. The participants in my study who showed the greatest promise of long-term intercultural success were the ones who demonstrated both high CQ and high border crossing concern. They expressed an internal value or conviction about the rightness of crossing borders, and they also evidenced high CQ. In contrast, some participants showed low degrees of both. One in particular seemed very poorly able to interact across uncomfortable borders, suggesting low CQ, and he also showed a life orientation or concern towards staying close to the familiarity of home, interpersonally and ideologically. People and ideas outside his familiar zone were neither very interesting nor very important to him, and in fact, they were a bit threatening. Others showed high CQ and low concern. They had the skill to cross cultures and the motivation to succeed in specific and defined cross-cultural tasks, but they lacked the conviction to seek out new opportunities or apply themselves to anything more than transactional cross-cultural relationships. For example, one young woman recalled a few interesting experiences with people and ideas outside her familiar culture, which was a tightly knit immigrant group, and she recounted times when she had needed to interact cross-culturally for particular objectives. However, her identity was firmly rooted in her community, and she did not foresee that outsiders would be especially important to her life in the grand scheme of things. Even though she had high skill, she was very unlikely ever to put it to much use. Finally, some had low skill but high concern. These were encouraging because even though they spoke of blunders and difficulties in their current cross-cultural relationships, their deep convictions would keep them working on building CQ skill for the long term. These discoveries helped me to recognize that in order to sustain cultural effectiveness over the long term, people need both CQ and border crossing concern. In some ways, concern sounds a lot like motivation. After all, both are reasons to do something. But it's important to recognize how concern is different from motivation. Remember the dying embers? Motivation can be a vulnerable thing. Livermore gets close to the idea of concern when he urges readers to consider what he calls transcendent motivations. But my own research shows that concern's deeper sense of purpose is beyond motivation and separate from it. The difference between them becomes obvious in 4 ways. One, people can have one without the other. They can have enduring concern with or without immediate motivation, and vice versa. On one hand, they can utterly lack drive for a particular cross-cultural experience, perhaps through difficulty that arises, but they can nevertheless anchor a commitment to renew their motivation on a deeper sense of purpose that guides their lives. They can say, for example, I do not want to do this, showing their low motivation, but I must, showing their high concern. On the flip side, they can excitedly plunge into a cross-cultural endeavor with intrinsic or extrinsic motives, but without having a deeper sense of purpose. Concern and motivation are therefore independent of one another. 2, a person's concern and a person's motivation can be unrelated, with roots in very different aspects of life. The substance of concern or sense of purpose may have nothing directly to do with the cultural experience at hand. Someone's motivation might be to succeed cross-culturally for profit, partnership, or pleasure, for instance, but her concern could be related to a particular understanding about God, life itself, human flourishing, or interpersonal ethics. When that person faces challenges in life, including cross-cultural challenges, this sense of purpose defines the very reason for sticking with it and giving it one's very best. 3. Concern differs from motivation in that it actively affects every domain of CQ. It justifies attending to knowledge, behavior, strategy, and motivation, especially when doing so requires self-subordination. The Bible lessons each week address this effect in all 4 domains. Finally, concern is more a meta-commitment than a motivation. The prefix meta means over and including comprehensively. So a meta-commitment is a commitment to be committed. It is an active interworking of strategy and motivation, 2 separate domains of CQ, to preserve the commitment over time. Maybe a marriage analogy would be helpful in illustrating this idea of meta-commitment as something separate from motivation. When I see happy older couples who've been married 50 or 60 years, I think, oh, I want that. Have you ever felt that way? Meet Clovis and Velma. When they decided to get married almost 55 years ago, they were very motivated to have a strong and satisfying relationship. They had extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Not surprisingly, the extrinsic motives were far less compelling than the intrinsic. Their extrinsic motives included things like being able to save money, share effort, file joint income taxes, and other super romantic things like that. Their higher extrinsic motives may have been to please their parents, spend more time together, enjoy intimacy, and have children someday. Moving beyond the extrinsic, their intrinsic motivation, in a nutshell, was that they were absolutely crazy about each other. They genuinely loved each other and the idea of being united for life. That intrinsic motivation supplied a lot of fuel for success. No doubt about it. They were very, very motivated. But would they always feel that motivated? Isn't it an age-old adage that honeymoons come to an end? Difficulties come in marriage, as in life, and many of them cannot be anticipated. Fortunately, as best they could, Velma and Clovis prepared for hardships. They considered that in the faraway future they might hit a hard season and wonder, why bother? And not only did they want to have a very good answer for that fateful question, should it ever come, they wanted to do their very best to avoid it altogether. They would work to rekindle dying embers if they ever had to, but they knew it would be a lot more fun to maintain a roaring fire. So, they determined from the start to strategize ways to safeguard their motivation. We should all take note that that's a wedding of strategy and motivation. No pun intended, of course. And that strategizing included behavior. They established certain rules that worked for them in order to keep a watch on their hearts and habits, guidelines, for example, regarding interactions with people of the opposite sex, words they would use or avoid in arguments, and the scheduling of time alone. All of these rules were and still are for the purpose of staying motivated for the long term. So, isn't that restrictive? Why go to all that trouble? Why think of the possibility of failure from the start? What a downer! Why put boundaries around two grown adults who might not always want to abide by them? Because, beyond the motivation to have a good marriage, which is a very big and deep intrinsic motivation for sure, Clovis and Velma have bigger commitments in life. At the top of the list is a faith commitment that governs not only marriage, but ideally everything else. Why are they so motivated to be motivated? Why the meta-commitment? Their overarching system of life, far above their intrinsic and extrinsic motives, says that marriage should be characterized by day-to-day integrity and permanence. That's the ideal. Velma and Clovis will soon be celebrating 55 very satisfying years of marriage. Okay, well, maybe only 52 were very satisfying if they're being honest, but we all get the point. And actually, that is the point, isn't it? They have remained mindful of a very clear sense of purpose for strategy and motivation. They have always known why they should bother to keep those flames alive. It's the same with CQ. Deep down, do you know why you should bother to stay motivated? What's your higher commitment? Do you just want this particular effort to succeed, or is there some reason that you believe you should put your whole heart into it? We have thus seen that concern is far more than motivation. It is the very purpose for it. Border crossing concern, then, is a long-term meta-commitment rooted in the foundations of life that tells you why you should be motivated to cross borders skillfully in ways that change you. In conclusion, the combination of border crossing concern and CQ is called sustainable cultural concern. How sustainable is your cultural concern? One of your discussion assignments for this week is to consider this why bother question. Your CQ self-assessment suggested a general idea of your CQ skill. Think about the nature of your deeper concern and the life orientations on which it is founded. Is it of an in-group nature or a border-crossing nature? Work to articulate it thoughtfully because it will help you later. See the instructions in this week's discussion prompt.